In this part of the lecture, we look at the United Nations. The United Nations is an organization you've probably heard about, read about, seen, but maybe you're not aware of its component parts or the role that it plays in international law. Where did the United Nations come from? Well, it originated in a predecessor organization called the League of Nations. The League of Nations was created in the aftermath of World War I. The League of Nations was an attempt to bring the countries of the world together to discuss things, to work out things, to participate in a large global forum. However, the League of Nations was handicapped by the fact that the United States refused to join, and therefore the League of Nations was never able to enjoy the widespread success that it probably aspired to. The League of Nations did have some strong successes. We mentioned the Geneva Convention, the Hague Convention, having to do with how we treat prisoners of war and how we behave in wartime. But it had a number of failures as well, and probably the biggest failure is that it failed to prevent World War II. In 1942, the Allied nations, those United States, Britain, France, and their allies, decided that the League of Nations should be replaced and be replaced by a new organization. And in this new organization, of course, the United States would take a leadership role. And this new organization came to be known as the United Nations. It was founded in 1945, October of 1945, following the end of hostilities between the United States and Japan in World War II. Now, there are 6 principal organs of the UN, 6 groups, 6 sub-organizations that make up the UN. And we're going to talk about the 6, I'll name the 6, and then we'll talk about the first 3 in a little more detail. Now, the first is the General Assembly. The second is the United Nations Security Council. The third is the International Court of Justice. The fourth is the Economic and Social Council. The fifth, the Trusteeship Council. And the sixth, the Secretariat. Let's look at those first 3 organs in a little bit more detail. We start with the General Assembly. Now, what is the General Assembly? We start with what it's not. It's not a legislature. It's not a legislative body. It doesn't function as an ordinary legislature would do. However, it does play a legislative type role. It enacts motions, it enacts resolutions. All of this occurs in a very familiar legislative role. Now, the General Assembly is made up of 1 member from each of the 192 United Nations members. It's a forum in which each country has an equal vote, an equal say. The General Assembly, not a legislature, but can serve as a forum and a means of enabling states to work out their differences in a more peaceful setting. So the GA, the General Assembly, is designed to promote the United Nations missions, those things that are within the scope of the United Nations Treaty, in a way that is not violent, doesn't involve war, but instead involves compromise, negotiation, and back and forth in that method. Now, the next organ, again, one you probably heard about, the United Nations Security Council. The Security Council is the United Nations organ that has primary responsibility for maintaining world peace. And one could say that was the primary mission of the entire United Nations, to promote world peace. The Security Council includes 5 permanent members who are always members of the Security Council, and 10 rotating members. The rotating members are elected to serve terms by the General Assembly. There's been no indication that the veto is going away. In the same sense, the 5 permanent members, the most prominent, the most important members of the Allied powers, the United States, Russia, England, France, and China, the identity of those 5 members probably unlikely to change within any time soon. I assume that far into the future those will be the same 5 permanent members of the Security Council, and each of which will still wield a veto. The third and final entity we want to talk about is the International Court of Justice. This is the primary law enforcing element of the United Nations. It is the United Nations judicial branch. UN law does not force parties to submit to the jurisdiction of the International Court of Justice. However, those parties are able to voluntarily submit disputes to the court's jurisdiction. This voluntary nature has handicapped the court in large part because countries who are not willing to be subject to the rulings of the International Court of Justice simply opt out. Nevertheless, the International Court of Justice is the judicial branch of the United Nations, and as we see when we start talking more about international law, it's played a large role in determining what international law is or isn't, and what international law has to say about any particular issue.